Welcome to week 8 of distance learning. Has it really been 8 weeks already? Dang. The Germans invaded and took Poland in a shorter time than this has been. Speaking of European conflicts, this week we'll be going through Europe, so let's go.
Miss your old familiar friends, but waiting just around the bend. Everywhere you look, there's a heart, a hand to hold on to. Everywhere you look, there's a look of somebody who needs you. Everywhere you look, everywhere you look.
Oh look, it's Captain America again. He must have heard conflict in Europe and came right away. And look, he brought with him again this week's term of the week. Let's see what it is. This week's term of the week is NATO. NATO stands for the North American Treaty Organization. Even though it's not limited to North America, it's a military alliance between the governments of 30 North American and European countries. Now, you may remember from history class that NATO was created after World War II to try to counter the influence of the communist Soviet Union. That's never going to get old. So this week we'll start by going over the profiles of some of our most notable NATO allies in Europe. Let's start with Germany. After beating them in back-to-back world wars, the United States and Germany are on pretty friendly terms now. Germany has a strong economy. In fact, they are often called the economic engine of Europe. They have a solid military and rank number 4 in the world power rankings. Their major exports are, of course, cars, which many of you are familiar with, as well as machinery and chemicals. The German government is a federal parliamentary system and has a chancellor that acts like a prime minister. The current chancellor of Germany is Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel is a pretty smart cookie. She was a physics major in college and worked as a chemical engineer before getting into politics. She loves cooking and soccer, but she does have a major fear of dogs due to being bitten by one when she was younger. Now, why does this matter? Well, when Merkel met one of Germany's old-time rivals, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, he repeatedly used his pet dogs to try to intimidate her, and as you can see, it made her really uncomfortable. Germany's enemies are the various terrorist organizations in the Middle East, North Korea, and in a rivalry as old as time itself, Russia. Germany's allies are everyone in NATO, in particular their former sworn enemies, France, the US, and the land of my ancestors, the UK. Speaking of the UK, aka the United Kingdom, since we both got over that whole American Revolution deal and that one time they decided to burn down the White House in 1814, they're perhaps our closest ally. The US and the UK often refer to each other as having a special relationship. Our leaders have worked really well together and they like each other. A common language and culture probably helped quite a bit with that. FDR and Winston Churchill were really close, as well as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair and George Bush, and now Donald Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Hopefully you remember from the beginning of the year that most of our basic principles of government in the United States were inspired by the English, whether that be inspiration by good actions or bad actions. Now, when we say the United Kingdom, we're referring to the countries of Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, which are all under one United Kingdom, hence the name United Kingdom. Each country gets to send representatives to the UK Parliament. Now, when we say Great Britain, we're referring to the countries that are on the island of Great Britain, which would include Wales, England, and Scotland. So the two terms are almost synonymous. I should note that there's also two parts to Ireland. Northern Ireland, which is largely Protestant and is a part of the United Kingdom, and then just regular Ireland, which is mostly Catholic and they're their own independent nation. United Kingdom has a really strong economy and they have a strong military, ranking number 5 in the world power rankings. They often help the U.S. out in military conflicts, so those of you that may join the military and are sent overseas are likely to meet people from NATO, particularly the United Kingdom. UK system of government is a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. So yes, they do have a monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Now, the Queen of England does have some power, but not much at all, as she's largely a ceremonial role and she brings in millions of tourists who come to see the palace and history of the royal family. The person with the most political power in the UK is the Prime Minister, which is currently Boris Johnson. Now, Boris is an interesting guy as well. Besides his flowing locks of hair, the former mayor of London and now Prime Minister is known for loving to be outside, whether it's riding his bike or absolutely lighting kids up in rugby. Boris Johnson's also really well educated. He's a major history buff and he loves ancient Greece and Rome. In fact, here's a link to him debating one of the leading classical historians on who is better, ancient Greece or ancient Rome. If you're an ancient history buff, it's actually worth watching. Because of his atrocious yet memorable hair, Boris is sometimes compared to Donald Trump. And there are some comparisons to be had. For example, both are on the right wing of the political spectrum in their respective countries. Both are a bit untraditional in their political approaches, they're outspoken, and they are not strangers to controversy. The UK's allies are of course everyone in NATO, especially the US and France. They're also allies with their former colonies, India, Australia, and New Zealand. And they're also allies with Japan and Israel. And I forgot to mention Canada too, but it's Canada. Their enemies are our enemies: Russia, North Korea, Iran, and terror groups in the Middle East. Recently, the UK decided to leave the European Union, sometimes called the EU, which is a political and economic union of 27 European nations. It's kind of like the Articles of Confederation were, where each nation is its own nation and is independent, but they do trade some sovereignty to a central government that takes on some roles as well. Member states of the European Union have frictionless borders where you can travel between nations much like you can travel between states here. They also have a single economic market and a single currency between all member states called the euro. The capital of the European Union's parliament is in Brussels, Belgium, which is where elected representatives from regions of the member nations go to vote and debate on issues. Some people even call it the United States of Europe, which would have made George Washington really proud and eerily prospective. UK wanted to regain some of their sovereignty over their economic decisions and decisions regarding their border and immigration. They wanted these decisions to be made by their government and not other nations in Brussels. So they left. Then there's France. Besides having one of the most confusing and nonsensical languages in the world, and famously changing their flag in 1940 from this to this, the French also have a very strong economy and they're number 6 in the world power ranking. They have a unitary semi-presidential system of government where the president is the leader. The current president of France is Emmanuel Macron. Macron is a really interesting European leader. First, he's the youngest president in France's history. He's 42 now and he was elected when he was 39. He's a prize-winning piano player and he's written a bunch of novels that he's never published. Now here's where things get a little bit odd. He married his high school drama teacher, who was 24 years older than him, and they met when he was 15 and her student. So that's weird. France is just different. Anyway, France's allies are NATO nations. As I mentioned earlier, they're allies with the UK, and they're finally friends with Germany after a lot of historical conflict. They're friends with the US, although we've had a rocky relationship since World War II, though they did help us in conducting airstrikes in Syria recently. They're also allies with their former colonies, Algeria, Congo, and Canada. Their enemies? Of course, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Middle Eastern terrorists, and Russia. Now, Russia. I feel like we're getting to the final boss in a video game or the villain in a movie that's been lurking behind the scenes the whole time. And maybe that's because Russians are stereotypically the villain in every movie made in the 1980s.
I must break you.
Let's start with some basic facts about Russia. First of all, Russia is huge in terms of their land size. In fact, they're one of the few nations that actually spans 2 continents, Europe and Asia. However, their population is about a third the size of our population in the US, and their economy isn't quite as big as ours either. Now, you might be thinking, gosh, if they have so much land, why don't they have a bigger population? Well, that's because a good bit of their land looks like this. Just ask Napoleon and Hitler about Russian winters. It's not a fun time. And because of their landmass, Russia does have access to a lot of oil, and that is their major export, while their major imports are machinery, vehicles, and food, because Lord knows not much grows there. Russia does have an impressive military and ranks number 2 in the world power rankings. Which, by the way, if you've been wondering this whole time, hey, Mr. Lucas, who ranks number 1 in those world power rankings? Well, I don't even think I need to tell you the answer. Of course, you remember from history class that Russia used to be the Soviet Union until it all came crashing down in 1991. They got a little taste of Western culture, and just like a 10-year-old learning Fortnite dances, they just couldn't stop. Russia's government is officially called a federal semi-presidential government, though in reality it's a pseudo-democracy, which means it looks like a democracy, but when you get down to it, the elections are rigged and a small, powerful few actually hold power and control things. The current president, and essentially the dictator of Russia, is Vladimir Putin, who you've all met before. You may remember I mentioned he plays hockey, he plays the piano, and can sing a killer rendition of Blueberry Hill, and he's an avid outdoorsman. Oh yeah, and he was a former KGB spy. Russia's main allies today are China, North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran, while their main rivals are everyone in NATO, which includes the US, UK, Germany, and now Ukraine, not to mention terrorist groups in the Middle East, who, in case you haven't figured it out yet, hate everybody. Now you might be wondering, I thought the Cold War was over. We defeated communism. Why do the US and Russia still not like each other? Major competing powers tend to form rivalries to become the most powerful. To understand why Russia really doesn't like us, you have to also understand who is leading them him and how he came to power, which is exactly what your Ed Puzzle this week does. As someone who worked as a KGB spy, Putin has never liked the West and NATO, and he doesn't like us creeping our influence closer and closer to the Russian border. You see, when the Soviet Union fell, a bunch of new nations were formed and became independent, where they once had been under Soviet control as satellite states. If you were expecting Russia to leave some of these newly independent nations totally alone, I've got news for you. The chance that was going to happen is the same as me beating LeBron James one-on-one. Some of these new nations barely experienced 5 seconds of independence before Russia was simply like, Moscow! Even though they had new governments, the US and Russia competed for influence within them. Some nations, like Poland for example, have become very pro-West to the point they've even become part of our military alliance against Russia, NATO. Putin does not like seeing more Western democratic-like nations pop up on his doorstep because he's afraid they may influence those in Russia to rise up and rebel, something they've been known to do in the past. Putin also wants kind of what Stalin wanted, a pro-Russian buffer zone between Russia and the West. So the Russian military has been very active around the world trying to set up and maintain pro-Russian governments that don't like the US and the West. They've sent troops and military aid to back Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. They've sent troops to Venezuela to back the anti-American dictator President Maduro. They've also sent troops to Libya, and they're currently in Ukraine. Russia has also been accused of hacking into other nations' elections through using hackers to collect sensitive government information, and setting up bots, which are fake accounts that troll people on social media and spread fake news. In the 2016 presidential election, you might remember President Trump was accused of collaborating with Russians to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign and hack into her emails. All of these types of political sabotage are not surprising tools for someone that once used to be a spy. Speaking of spies, Putin has a vast network of spies, and I would be shocked if there weren't any in the United States and other Western nations right now. In fact, just a couple of years ago, a former Russian spy who defected to the United Kingdom was poisoned in the UK and almost died by the hand of 2 other Russian agents who got away. The United Kingdom was furious at Russia, who denied any wrongdoing, but definitely wanted to send a message to any other spies who were thinking of quitting. It's definitely not out of character for Putin, who has made journalists critical of him mysteriously disappear or die in elevator accidents on his birthday. And he's also arrested protesters without bail for hooliganism, such as this gay feminist protest punk rock group. You'll learn more about that little incident in this week's Ed Puzzle. So some argue the Cold War never really ended, or maybe we're in a second Cold War because the US and Russia seem to be involved all over the world trying to counteract each other's influence just like they did 50 years ago, leading some to believe maybe it wasn't actually communism we were trying to contain. This conflict is no more pressing and evident than in Ukraine. Back in 2014, Russian forces invaded the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. Ukraine's government had been cozying up to the West and had even talked about joining NATO. Putin was not having any of that and sent troops into Ukraine, where Putin claimed they were there to liberate the oppressed Russian minority who wanted to be a part of Russia, which, gosh, that sounds awfully familiar.
Von 3,5 Millionen Volksgenossen gegenüber gleichgültig zu sein und an ihrem Unglück keinen Anteil mehr zu nehmen.
So since 2014, Russian troops have been assisting pro-Russian Ukrainians fight a limited war against pro-Western Ukrainians backed by the United States, and NATO is another classic example of a proxy war. You may also remember this past year, the whole controversy surrounding impeachment actually started with something President Trump did with Ukraine. President Trump called to congratulate the new Ukrainian president on his election win this past summer. On that call, some people accused President Trump of asking the Ukrainian president to dig up dirt on Joe Biden's son, Hunter, who had some controversy while working with the Ukrainian oil company in exchange for more U.S. anti-tank missiles. Democrats said this was an impeachable offense since Article 2 of the Constitution says the president can be impeached and removed for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. They thought this was bribery. And you know the rest of the story. Now, people in the U.S. have been fiercely debating what to do about Russian aggression. Do we get involved by providing military assistance and stand up to Putin? After all, when Hitler was unopposed, he continued to take land in Europe before World War II, which the Allies had to fight to reclaim inch by inch. Or do we completely stay out of it and let Ukraine and Russia settle it on their own so we don't accidentally spark an actual war between us and Russia? After all, we've seen how U.S. intervention in the past has caused blowback or unintended consequences that can make things worse. Do we place sanctions on Russia to hurt their economy so they back down, or will that make them more desperate and angry at us, like our sanctions did with Japan before World War II? What about cyber warfare? These are precisely the questions that your CTQ will ask you to investigate this week. So your assignments this week: an Ed Puzzle on the rise of Vladimir Putin, a Google form on NATO, A CTQ, which, like last week, you're going to pretend you're a national security advisor to the president and propose a policy to the president you think should be pursued in regards to Russia. Use the resources provided in the doc for you to research the various pros and cons of each policy, and feel free to combine policies or make your own. Just make sure you defend it. As always, everything is due by Friday night at 11:59 p.m. Good luck.